It was a bright Sunday morning in Memphis, Tennessee, and the New Hope Baptist Church stood as a beacon of serenity in the heart of the community. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows, casting a kaleidoscope of colors across the pews and illuminating the faces of the congregation. The church was filled to capacity, and the atmosphere was vibrant with hope and faith. Pastor Derek Hunter, an esteemed African-American leader in the community, delivered his sermon with passion, his deep voice resonating through the sanctuary. His reputation as a moral and spiritual guide had drawn people from all walks of life to his church, and today was no exception. Families, elders, and youth alike sat enraptured, their eyes fixed on the man who had become a pillar of strength and guidance for so many. The choir stood to the side of the altar, their harmonious voices blending seamlessly with the solemn notes of the organ. Every word Pastor Derek spoke seemed to lift the spirits of those listening. The energy in the room was palpable, a collective faith that seemed unshakable. Mothers clutched their children, couples exchanged knowing glances of comfort, and elders nodded in agreement to the pastor's words. It was a moment of unity, a moment of peace. Suddenly, the double doors at the back of the sanctuary burst open, the loud sound of their impact cutting through the pastor's words like a jagged knife. Heads turned, the collective gasp of the congregation echoing through the church. Standing in the doorway was a young man, his figure outlined against the bright sunlight pouring in from outside. His disheveled appearance was impossible to ignore, his clothes were wrinkled, his hair was unkempt, and in his shaking hands, he clutched a gun. It was Marcus James, a 19-year-old from the very community this church served. His face was a mixture of anguish and fury, his eyes wild with a pain that no one in the room fully understood at that moment. The church fell into a stunned silence, the once comforting sanctuary now gripped by an almost unbearable tension. Marcus took a step forward, his movements erratic, and the sound of his heavy boots against the polished wooden floor echoed ominously. His chest heaved as if he had run a great distance, though it was clear the weight he carried was not physical but emotional. Every gaze in the room was fixed on him, frozen in collective disbelief. As Marcus advanced down the aisle, his voice filled the room, trembling but loud enough to reverberate against the high ceilings. His accusations cut through the sacred air like shards of glass. He spoke with a mixture of anger and despair, each word laced with raw emotion. The congregation sat motionless, their breaths held, as the reality of the situation unfolded before their eyes. Pastor Derek stood at the altar, his previously commanding presence now reduced to a quiet stillness. His eyes widened as he recognized Marcus, his expression shifting from shock to something deeper, perhaps guilt, perhaps fear, or a mixture of both. Marcus's steps quickened as he neared the front of the sanctuary, his grip on the weapon tightening. The scene seemed to stretch in time, each second heavier than the last. Children clung to their parents, some members of the congregation instinctively ducked behind the pews, and the choir froze in place, their voices silenced by the chaos. Derek raised a hand, as if to calm Marcus, but the gesture was too late. Marcus lifted the gun, and in the blink of an eye, the deafening sound of gunfire shattered the air. The first shot rang out, its sharp crack reverberating off the walls. Derek staggered, clutching his chest as a crimson stain spread across his shirt. The second shot followed almost immediately, striking him again and sending him collapsing onto the steps of the altar. Screams erupted from the congregation as panic broke out. People scrambled to the exits, their shouts and cries blending into a cacophony of chaos. The sanctuary, once a place of peace and worship, was now a scene of pandemonium. Marcus stood frozen, the gun still in his hand, smoke curling from its barrel. His chest heaved as he stared at Derek's fallen figure, the weight of what he had done slowly sinking in. His anger dissolved almost instantly, replaced by overwhelming guilt and despair. The gun slipped from his trembling fingers, clattering onto the floor. His legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed to his knees in the center aisle. Tears streamed down his face as he buried his head in his hands, his body racked with sobs that echoed in the now half-empty sanctuary. Derek lay on the floor near the altar, blood pooling beneath him as his wife, Anissa, rushed to his side. Her hands trembled as she pressed against his wounds in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. Her cries of anguish filled the room, a raw and unfiltered expression of heartbreak and fear. Around her, a few remaining members of the congregation stood paralyzed, unsure of what to do, their faith shaken by the violence that had unfolded before their eyes. The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, signaling the arrival of law enforcement and paramedics. Within moments, police officers entered the church, their weapons drawn, scanning the room for danger. Marcus did not resist as they approached him. He sat motionless, his tear-streaked face vacant, as they handcuffed him and led him away. Paramedics rushed to Derek, quickly assessing his injuries before lifting him onto a stretcher. Blood stained the once pristine white cloth that covered the altar, a grim reminder of the violence that had shattered the morning. As the ambulance sped away with Derek inside, and Marcus was taken into custody, the church fell into an eerie silence. The pews were empty, the stained glass windows cast distorted patterns of light on the bloodied floor, and the air was heavy with the weight of what had just transpired. The remaining members of the congregation stood outside in small clusters, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. The sacred space that had once united them in faith now stood as a crime scene, forever changed by the events of that morning. Derek Hunter was born and raised in South Memphis, Tennessee, a part of the city known for its economic struggles and high crime rates. His early years were defined by hardship and resilience. The youngest of three siblings, Derek grew up in a small, aging house where his mother worked tirelessly as a nurse's aide to keep food on the table. His father, once a factory worker, had passed away suddenly when Derek was only 10 years old. The loss hit the family hard, but none harder than Derek. He was just beginning to understand the weight of responsibility and now faced the harsh realities of life without a father figure. In the years following his father's death, Derek struggled. He became withdrawn and angry, spending more time on the streets than in school. By the time he reached his teenage years, he had fallen in with a group of boys who spent their days roaming the neighborhood and their nights engaging in petty crimes. Derek's charm and natural charisma made him a leader among them, but deep down, he carried a sense of shame for the path he was on. His mother, deeply rooted in her faith, prayed for him daily, begging God to guide her son back to the light. It was her unwavering belief and quiet strength that began to shift something in Derek. She would often sit at the kitchen table after her long shifts, reading her Bible aloud as Derek pretended not to listen from the living room. Her voice, steady and full of conviction, began to stir something deep within him. The turning point came one night when a robbery gone wrong left one of Derek's closest friends wounded. The fear and guilt he felt that night were enough to make him reevaluate his life. At his mother's urging, Derek began attending church again, reluctantly at first. The community at New Hope Baptist Church welcomed him with open arms, and he found solace in the rhythm of the sermons and the hymns. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose, something larger than himself to believe in. The church became his sanctuary, a place where he could shed the weight of his past mistakes. He threw himself into the teachings of the Bible, finding hope and direction in its verses. Slowly, he became an active member of the congregation, participating in youth programs and helping with community outreach. By the time he was 25, Derek had found his calling. He completed his theological studies and was ordained as a pastor. The transformation was nothing short of remarkable. The same charisma that had once led him astray now became a tool for good, drawing people to him and inspiring them to change their lives. Derek's sermons were powerful and relatable, infused with his own experiences and struggles. He built a reputation as a man of integrity, someone who understood the challenges of the community because he had lived through them himself. At 30, he founded New Hope Baptist Church, starting with a modest congregation that met in a rented community center. Over the years, the church grew, and Derek's reputation as a spiritual leader solidified. Despite his public image as a devoted husband to his wife, Anissa, and a compassionate leader, Derek carried a secret that threatened to unravel everything he had built. It began innocently enough during one of the youth programs at the church. Derek had always had a soft spot for the young men in the community who reminded him of himself at their age, angry, aimless, and in need of guidance. When he met Marcus James, a shy 19-year-old from a troubled background, Derek saw an opportunity to make a difference. Marcus had grown up in a neighborhood not far from where Derek had spent his own childhood. His mother worked 2 jobs to make ends meet, and his father had been absent for most of his life. Marcus was quiet, reserved, and seemed reluctant to open up to anyone. Derek took him under his wing, offering mentorship and a listening ear. At first, their relationship was entirely above reproach. Derek saw it as his duty to provide guidance to Marcus, just as others had done for him when he needed it most. But as time went on, their interactions became more frequent and personal. Derek began to confide in Marcus about his own struggles and insecurities, and Marcus, in turn, found himself drawn to Derek's warmth and attention. The boundary between mentor and mentee blurred, and what began as an innocent connection slowly transformed into something neither of them could fully control. Derek was acutely aware of the line he was crossing, but he convinced himself that his intentions were pure. He rationalized his actions, telling himself that he was simply helping Marcus, that the emotional closeness was a natural extension of their bond. But deep down, he knew the truth. The relationship had become inappropriate, a betrayal not only of his role as a pastor but also of the trust his congregation and his wife had placed in him. Determined to keep his secret, Derek became increasingly guarded. He took great care to ensure that his interactions with Marcus remained hidden, meeting him in private and avoiding any situations that might raise suspicion. The weight of the deception grew heavier with each passing day, but Derek convinced himself that he could manage it. He believed he could compartmentalize his life, keeping his role as a pastor and his forbidden relationship with Marcus separate. Unbeknownst to Derek, Marcus had begun to struggle with the secrecy of their relationship. What Derek saw as a necessary measure to protect his reputation, Marcus interpreted as rejection and shame. The cracks in their dynamic began to show, but Derek, blinded by his own guilt and fear of exposure, failed to see the storm brewing on the horizon. Derek Hunter's life had become a carefully constructed performance, one that required constant vigilance and meticulous control. To his congregation, he was the epitome of a righteous man, a devoted husband to Anissa, a loving father, and an unwavering spiritual leader. Every Sunday, he stood at the pulpit of New Hope Baptist Church, delivering sermons that moved people to tears and inspired hope in their hearts. His charisma and compassion made him the backbone of the community, a man who seemed above reproach. At home, he maintained the image of a dutiful husband, sharing quiet dinners with Anissa and participating in family routines. He played the role so well that even those closest to him had no reason to suspect the secrets he was hiding. Behind closed doors, Derek's life was far from the pristine image he projected. His relationship with Marcus James had grown into something he could no longer dismiss as a mere lapse in judgment. What had begun as mentorship had spiraled into a complex and dangerous entanglement. Marcus, with his youthful intensity and unrelenting need for connection, became a central figure in Derek's private world. They met in discreet locations, always careful to avoid any situation that might arouse suspicion. Derek assured himself that he had everything under control, that his secret life could coexist alongside his public persona without either unraveling. At first, Marcus seemed content with the arrangement. He was grateful for Derek's attention, for the way the older man made him feel seen and valued. But as weeks turned into months, Marcus began to want more. He grew tired of the secrecy, of the constant hiding and half-truths. The moments they shared, however passionate or meaningful, were always shrouded in guilt and fear. Marcus wanted Derek to acknowledge their relationship openly, to stop treating him as something that needed to be concealed. For Marcus, the secrecy felt like rejection, a denial of his worth, and it began to eat away at him. Derek, however, was paralyzed by fear. He knew the consequences of his actions and what would happen if his double life were exposed. The congregation that revered him would turn against him. Anissa, the woman who had stood by his side through years of triumphs and trials, would feel the full weight of his betrayal. Everything he had built, his church, his family, his reputation, would come crashing down. And so, he tried to maintain the precarious balance, placating Marcus with promises and gifts while doubling down on his commitments to the church and his family. The strain of living two lives began to take its toll on Derek. He became more irritable at home, more distant with Anissa. She noticed his late nights, his distracted demeanor, but when she asked if something was wrong, he always had an explanation ready. At church, Derek continued to perform, but the cracks in his facade were starting to show. His once fiery sermons began to lose their edge, and members of the congregation occasionally remarked on how tired he looked. Derek dismissed their concerns with a reassuring smile, but inside, he felt the weight of his deception growing heavier by the day. For Marcus, the situation became unbearable. He had invested so much of himself in the relationship, believing that Derek's love for him would eventually outweigh the fear of exposure. But as Derek grew more cautious, pulling away to protect his public image, Marcus felt increasingly abandoned. The promises Derek made began to feel hollow, and the sporadic meetings were no longer enough to satisfy the deep emotional connection Marcus craved. Resentment started to build, fueled by a sense of betrayal and rejection. The tension between them reached a breaking point during one of their secret meetings. Marcus, tired of being sidelined, demanded answers. He wanted Derek to choose, to either commit fully to their relationship or end it altogether. Derek, caught off guard and desperate to keep Marcus quiet, tried to placate him with vague reassurances and financial support. He promised that things would get better, that he just needed more time to figure everything out. But Marcus had heard it all before. This time, he wasn't willing to be appeased. Feeling cornered, Marcus issued an ultimatum. He threatened to reveal their relationship to Anissa and the congregation, knowing full well what such a revelation would mean for Derek. The threat hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Derek, terrified of the fallout, begged for more time. He promised to increase the financial support he was already providing and assured Marcus that he would find a solution. But the damage had been done. Marcus saw Derek's desperation as proof that he would never truly prioritize their relationship, that he would always choose his reputation and his position over him. In the days that followed, Marcus wrestled with his emotions. His love for Derek was still there, but it was now overshadowed by anger and a sense of betrayal. He replayed their conversations in his mind, each broken promise fueling his resolve. The secrecy, the lies, the constant feeling of being hidden and unworthy, it all became too much. Marcus decided that he could no longer stay silent. He began to plan his next move, determined to confront Derek in a way that would force him to acknowledge the truth, no matter the consequences. As Marcus's anger simmered, Derek's anxiety grew. He could sense that Marcus was reaching a breaking point, but he didn't know how to stop it. Every interaction with Marcus felt like walking a tightrope, one misstep away from disaster. At the same time, he struggled to maintain the illusion of normalcy in his public life, knowing that the foundation of his carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. Derek clung to the hope that he could somehow keep his secret buried, but deep down, he knew the storm was coming. And when it arrived, there would be no hiding from the truth. Derek Hunter awoke in a sterile hospital room, the fluorescent lights casting a cold glow on the white walls. His body ached, a deep, throbbing pain emanating from the wounds in his chest and abdomen. The steady beeping of monitors was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic reminder of his fragile state. As his eyes adjusted, the gravity of his situation began to settle in. He was alive, but the life he had so carefully constructed was on the verge of collapse. The truth he had worked so hard to bury was now exposed, and there would be no going back. News of the shooting had spread rapidly across Memphis. The name of Pastor Derek Hunter, once synonymous with faith and leadership, was now being uttered in hushed tones filled with shock and disbelief. Outside the hospital, reporters gathered in droves, their cameras and microphones aimed at anyone who might offer a comment. The shooting at New Hope Baptist Church was no longer just a tragedy, it was a scandal. Derek knew that the story would not fade quietly into the background. Questions would be asked, and answers would be demanded. Meanwhile, Marcus James sat alone in a small, dimly lit cell at the local detention center. The events of the church service replayed in his mind like a relentless nightmare. His hand still trembled as he thought about the gun, the screams, and the look on Derek's face as he collapsed. Guilt consumed him, overwhelming every other emotion. He had acted out of anger and betrayal, but now, sitting in the suffocating silence of the cell, he felt only regret. The weight of what he had done pressed down on him, and the reality of his actions began to sink in. He had shattered not only Derek's life, but his own as well. At the hospital, Anissa Hunter sat in the waiting room, her hands clasped tightly together. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from hours of crying. She had not left the building since Derek was brought in, her mind racing with unanswered questions. The chaos of the shooting had been traumatic enough, but it was the revelations that followed that truly broke her. Through whispers and fragmented accounts from members of the congregation, she had pieced together the shocking truth: her husband, the man she had built her life with, had been living a double life. The betrayal cut deeper than she thought possible. Anissa felt like a stranger to her own marriage, her trust and faith shattered in an instant. As Derek recovered in the hospital, the outside world erupted with speculation and judgment. The media seized the story, broadcasting every detail they could uncover. Headlines painted a picture of a fallen pastor, a respected man of God exposed as a fraud. Interviews with members of the congregation revealed a community in turmoil. Some expressed disbelief, clinging to the hope that it was all a misunderstanding. Others voiced anger and betrayal, struggling to reconcile the man they admired with the man the scandal had revealed. The church itself became the focal point of the community's pain and confusion. New Hope Baptist Church, once a sanctuary for so many, was now a symbol of broken trust. The church elders convened emergency meetings to address the crisis, but their efforts were complicated by new revelations. As they dug deeper into Derek's financial records, they uncovered discrepancies that pointed to years of mismanagement and potential fraud. Donations intended for the church's outreach programs had been funneled into private accounts. Expenses for lavish trips and unexplained withdrawals painted a damning picture. The scandal extended far beyond Derek's personal life, threatening the very foundation of the church he had built. Within the church, factions began to form. Some members rallied around Derek, refusing to believe the accusations and attributing his actions to human imperfection. Others called for his immediate removal, arguing that he had betrayed not only his family but the entire congregation. The elders faced mounting pressure to take decisive action, but the weight of the revelations left them paralyzed, unsure of how to proceed. Anissa, meanwhile, wrestled with her own internal conflict. The man she had loved and supported was not the man she thought she knew. She felt humiliated, betrayed, and angry, but she also felt a lingering sense of duty. She had vowed to stand by Derek in sickness and in health, for better or worse, and now she was faced with the ultimate test of that promise. She alternated between moments of steely resolve and overwhelming despair, unsure of what her next step should be. As the days turned into weeks, the fallout from the shooting continued to grow. The church's attendance plummeted as members distanced themselves from the scandal. Derek's name became a topic of gossip and condemnation in the community. Anissa avoided the media and the prying questions of neighbors, finding solace only in moments of solitude. She knew she had to make a decision, but the weight of it threatened to crush her. Should she support Derek as he faced the consequences of his actions, or should she leave him and begin to rebuild her life on her own terms? The choice loomed over her like a dark cloud, a reminder that the life she once knew was gone forever. Derek Hunter stood before the congregation of New Hope Baptist Church, his shoulders slumped under the weight of his own guilt. The sanctuary was no longer the vibrant place it had once been. The pews, once filled with devoted members, were sparsely occupied. The faces that looked back at him were not ones of admiration but of disappointment, confusion, and anger. The room was silent, heavy with the anticipation of what he was about to say. Derek's voice, usually commanding and full of conviction, trembled as he began to speak. He confessed to everything: the affair, the lies, the misuse of church funds. He spared no detail, laying bare the truth that he had hidden for so long. As the words poured out, Derek felt the crushing weight of his actions. His reputation as a pastor and a moral leader was gone. The man he had presented to the world was now exposed as a fraud. He acknowledged the pain he had caused to his wife, Anissa, to Marcus James, and to the entire congregation that had trusted him. His confession was not met with forgiveness or understanding. It was met with silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. The congregation, torn between their faith and their anger, remained stoic, their eyes fixed on the man who had betrayed them. Meanwhile, Marcus James sat in a courtroom, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He was dressed in a plain suit, his demeanor subdued and remorseful. The events of the shooting weighed heavily on him, and as the judge called his name, he stood to face the consequences of his actions. Marcus admitted to the crime, explaining how anger and heartbreak had driven him to the brink. His voice was steady but filled with regret as he recounted the moments leading up to the shooting. He apologized to Derek, to Anissa, and to the congregation. His words, though sincere, could not undo the damage, but they marked the beginning of his journey toward atonement. The court acknowledged Marcus's emotional state and the mitigating circumstances surrounding his actions. He was sentenced to probation and ordered to attend mandatory therapy sessions. The judge emphasized the importance of addressing the underlying issues that had led Marcus to that moment of violence. It was a second chance, one that Marcus did not take lightly. He left the courtroom knowing that his path forward would not be easy, but it would be one of redemption. Anissa Hunter, watching from the back of the church during Derek's confession, felt a wave of emotions that she could hardly process. The man she had once loved and trusted was now a stranger. She had stood by him through the initial shock of the shooting, but his public confession forced her to confront the full scope of his betrayal. As Derek stepped down from the pulpit, his head bowed, she knew that the life they had built together was beyond repair. That night, she packed her belongings and left the home they had shared, determined to find a new path for herself. In the weeks that followed, Anissa began to forge a new identity. The congregation, disillusioned and leaderless, looked to her for guidance. She had always been a quiet presence in the church, supporting Derek from the sidelines, but now she stepped into the spotlight. With a calm determination, she began the arduous task of rebuilding the community's trust. She organized meetings with church elders, spearheaded outreach programs, and worked tirelessly to ensure that New Hope Baptist Church could rise from the ashes of scandal. Her leadership was not without challenges. There were whispers of doubt and resentment, but her resilience inspired many to stay and support the church's renewal. Derek, now stripped of his role as pastor, found himself at a crossroads. The city of Memphis, once his home and his sanctuary, had become a place of pain and shame. The congregation had voted to remove him from his position, and the church's elders had filed formal complaints regarding his financial misdeeds. Facing the possibility of legal consequences and unable to bear the sight of the damage he had caused, Derek made the decision to leave. He packed his belongings into a modest suitcase and quietly departed the city. In the quiet of his solitude, Derek began a journey of self-reflection. He moved to a small town in another state, far from the spotlight of Memphis. He took on simple, humble work and began attending therapy sessions to confront the choices he had made and the harm he had caused. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of his actions. It was a painful process, but it was also necessary. Derek knew that redemption would not come from words or grand gestures, but from a sincere commitment to change. Back in Memphis, Marcus began his own path to healing. Therapy sessions helped him unpack the anger and pain that had driven him to such a destructive act. Slowly, he began to understand the complexities of his emotions and learned healthier ways to cope. He also sought to make amends in any way he could, volunteering at local organizations that supported at-risk youth. His experiences gave him a unique perspective, and he used his story as a cautionary tale to help others avoid the same mistakes. Anissa continued to lead the church with grace and determination. Under her guidance, the congregation began to heal, though the scars of Derek's actions remained. She worked tirelessly to ensure that the church's resources were used transparently, restoring faith in the institution. Over time, New Hope Baptist Church became a symbol of resilience and renewal, a testament to the power of community and forgiveness. For Derek, the road to redemption was long and winding. He remained distant from Memphis, aware that his presence would only reopen old wounds. But he stayed in touch with Anissa, offering her his support from afar. Their relationship, once defined by love and trust, had been irrevocably altered, but there was a quiet understanding between them. Derek knew that he could never undo the harm he had caused, but he was committed to living the rest of his life with humility and integrity. As the months turned into years, the story of Derek, Marcus, and Anissa became one of transformation rather than tragedy. Each of them, in their own way, found a path forward, shaped by the choices they had made and the lessons they had learned. It was not a perfect ending, but it was a real one, marked by growth, healing, and the possibility of a better future. Several years had passed since the fateful events at New Hope Baptist Church, and the institution had undergone a profound transformation. Under Anissa Hunter's leadership, the church was no longer simply a place of worship but had evolved into New Hope Community Center, a beacon of support and guidance for the local community in Memphis. What had once been a congregation shaken to its core by scandal was now a thriving hub for youth outreach programs, victim advocacy, and community empowerment. Anissa's vision had taken root, and the center had become a symbol of resilience and renewal. Anissa's days were long but fulfilling. She spent her mornings meeting with community leaders and planning new initiatives, her afternoons counseling victims of domestic violence, and her evenings overseeing youth mentorship programs. The community center offered everything from educational workshops to safe spaces for those in crisis. Anissa had poured her heart into building an institution that embodied the values the church had once claimed but failed to uphold: compassion, integrity, and service to others. Her quiet strength and unwavering dedication had earned her respect far beyond the congregation. People from all walks of life looked to her as a leader and a source of inspiration. Marcus James had also found a new purpose. After completing his education, he began working with at-risk youth in the same neighborhoods where he had once struggled. His experience gave him a unique ability to connect with the young men and women he mentored. He spoke candidly about his mistakes and the lessons he had learned, using his story as a tool to guide others away from the paths of anger and violence. Marcus had become a living example of redemption, his life now dedicated to preventing others from making the same choices he once had. His work was challenging, but it was also deeply rewarding, and he found healing in helping others heal. The New Hope Community Center was thriving, but the scars of the past still lingered in subtle ways. Some members of the old congregation had never returned, unable to reconcile the church's history with its new mission. Others had embraced the changes wholeheartedly, finding in the center a sense of purpose and belonging they had never experienced before. Slowly but surely, the community had begun to rebuild its trust in the institution, and the work being done at New Hope was changing lives. One Sunday morning, during a community service that brought together people from all over the city, an unfamiliar yet familiar figure appeared at the entrance of the sanctuary. Derek Hunter stood quietly at the door, his once imposing frame now slightly hunched with the weight of years of regret and introspection. His face was lined, his hair graying at the temples, but there was a humility in his presence that hadn't been there before. He hadn't set foot in Memphis since he had left, but something had drawn him back to the place where his life had unraveled and where, in many ways, it had also begun. The room fell silent as Derek walked slowly down the aisle. The congregation, many of whom had not seen him since the scandal, watched him with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He stopped at the front of the room, his gaze meeting Anissa's. She stood at the pulpit, her expression calm but unreadable. Marcus, seated in the front row, looked up, his face betraying the flicker of surprise. Derek's presence was unexpected, but neither Anissa nor Marcus moved to stop him as he turned to face the congregation. Derek began to speak, his voice steady but subdued. He told his story, not to justify his actions, but to share the hard lessons he had learned. He spoke of his fall from grace, the pain he had caused, and the long journey of self-reflection and repentance he had undertaken. He acknowledged the people he had hurt, from his wife to Marcus to the congregation itself. Derek's words were not polished or rehearsed, they were raw and honest, carrying the weight of a man who had spent years grappling with the consequences of his choices. The congregation listened in silence. Some faces were stern, others contemplative. It was clear that not everyone was ready to forgive, and Derek did not ask for forgiveness. Instead, he offered his story as a testament to the power of accountability and the possibility of change. He spoke of the work he had done since leaving Memphis, mentoring others who had lost their way and striving to live a life of humility and service. By the time he finished, the room was heavy with emotion, a mixture of pain, understanding, and tentative hope. After a moment of silence, Anissa stepped forward. She thanked Derek for sharing his story, acknowledging the courage it took to face the people he had wronged. Her words were measured and calm, a reflection of the strength she had cultivated over the years. Marcus stood as well, nodding briefly toward Derek before speaking to the congregation about the importance of redemption and the strength it takes to rebuild after a fall. Together, their presence framed the day not as a reopening of old wounds, but as a step toward collective healing. As the service concluded, Derek quietly left the sanctuary. He did not linger, knowing that his presence could disrupt the delicate progress the community had made. He left Memphis later that day, returning to the life he had built elsewhere. But his visit left an impression on those who had heard him speak, a reminder that even the deepest scars could carry lessons and that redemption was a journey, not a destination. The New Hope Community Center continued to grow, its mission expanding to meet the needs of a city that had been through so much. Under Anissa's leadership, the center became a cornerstone of the community, a place where people could find support, guidance, and hope. Marcus's work with youth deepened, and his influence extended beyond the city, inspiring others to address the systemic issues that plagued their neighborhoods. Together, Anissa and Marcus had taken the ashes of a broken institution and built something stronger, something real. The scars of the past would never fully fade, but they had become part of the story, a story of failure, forgiveness, and the resilience of the human spirit. The New Hope Community Center stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people chose to confront the truth and work together to create something better. And in that, there was a kind of redemption that went beyond words, a redemption that was lived every day in the lives that were touched and the futures that were changed.